from Rome to Florence to Venice, and various areas around there. So, for instance, to travel from Rome to Florence takes about 7 days at this time. A letter might get there between 5 to 7 days in the regular post. And if you really had to get there quickly, a messenger could get there in 3 days. I'm going to be talking primarily about the transition between the Renaissance and the Baroque. This wonderful timeline is a work in progress because every timeline I could find online either was way too broad, just talking medieval, Renaissance, Baroque, or was not focused on the things that I actually cared about. So I need to fill in some more here in the Renaissance and a bit more as the transition happens. But I'm going to be focusing mostly right over here because there was a big change within about 25 years. And a lot of styles came through at that time. Many of you may recognize the quadrivium. This is 4 of the 7 liberal arts focused on arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, or how numbers interact with each other in space, in time, and over space and time. This had been the basis of a liberal arts education, along with grammar, rhetoric, and logic, since at least the 6th century of our current era. And it started getting reprinted once we had the wonderful printing press in 1490 from works by Boethius. And so scholars were being taught about arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy from a theoretical perspective, from the idea of the ratios of one note to another and of the vibrations of a string from one to another. And then we started getting new ideas and in the Renaissance, where we had this rebirth, this excitement and attention to Roman and Greek history. Now, I want to put you into a moment back then. This is music by the premier composer of the Renaissance, Palestrino. Oh. And I'm going to play this for you. Move into it. Picture being at a cathedral, at a wedding of the time, in one of these beautiful spaces, and you have this gorgeous singing going on. And that some of the people in the audience, composers, theorists, are listening to this and going, this is beautiful, this is gorgeous, but I can't understand the words. I can't understand what they're trying to convey. I really want to know, what is it that they're trying to convey in this music? And so they started thinking on the idea of, how can I convey music better in, convey emotion better in music? So now I want to introduce to you 2 people, Vincenzo Galilei and Girolamo May, the scholar of ancient Greek texts, hanging around in Rome and writing letters to Vincenzo, the lute virtuoso and the father of Galileo Galilei. Now, Vincenzo had in his basement strings, basically extended over a table and then hanging over the edge with a weight holding the end of the string. And he would experiment on how a heavier weight would change the pitch and the sound of the string. And he was really excited about this experimental music, not the theoretical, you must have the correct ratio, but the actual experimental, what happens to the string itself, which had not been studied since Aristophanes, the music theorist, back in ancient Greece. And it happened that Girolamo was studying Aristophanes, Plato, and other ancient Greeks there in Rome. And these two were sending letters back and forth, constantly talking about this. And finally, Vincenzo asked Girolamo. How and why was Greek music able to set poetic texts so expressively? I mean, Aristophanes and Plato talked about how different modes of music would be able to calm a savage person or to incite to war. How were they able to set their poetic texts to express emotions? Girolamo's answer: they used a single melodic line, not multiple lines in harmony. They used monody, not polyphony. And so Vincenzo had this idea in his head, and he decided to bring together like-minded individuals who were interested in how to convey emotion more effectively in music. And so he brought together the Florentine Camarata. Many people would join them over the years of 1577 through 1582 for the first part, and later they continued. But these were the usual suspects, the people that were there for most of their meetings. They met at the house of Giovanni di Bardi, the composer. They had Girolamo and Vincenzo there. And then they also had Jacopo Corsi, Jacopo Peri, also known as Il Zazzarino, quite the performer, and Giulio Caccini, the librettist and theorist. Later on today, you'll be hearing about Francesco Caccini. He's her father. So they got together and they talked about ancient Greek music, about modern composing, about what they liked about the music that they were composing and they were hearing, and what they wanted from it. And they published works about this and talked about key ideas: that the text should be more important than the music, that monody was more important than polyphony, and that recitative, this idea of being able to convey many, many words in a short space, it was more than speech, but less than song. Recitative was the way to perform, to get emotions across. Now, you note that aria is missing here. Aria will come later in history. They were not dealing with aria quite yet. And so they got together. Now, I note that, no, let me back up here. What came together here was the idea of opera, where you had the text being more important than the music, that you had one person singing. Now, admittedly, opera has both choral and solo portions, but the solo part became much more important than the polyphony that we had been hearing beforehand. And recitative became the usual way of performing. Now, this Florentine Camarata was not the only group that was talking about these ideas. There was a Roman school that also brought together these ideas, but within the strictures of the Catholic Church, where you had restrictions on spectacle. And so they wanted to do more performances that were like a concert instead of like a theatrical drama. And so we got these two different ideas of opera and oratorio, both happening right within the same 25 years, both being created. They came from the idea of the intermezzi and intermedia that were happening before then, often at great weddings of the leaders of Italy at the time, often having all of these huge props and costumes and everything going on, but also dramatic performances which then had musical interludes or intermezzi. The opera and the oratorio no longer were dramatic plays, they were actually true composed. All of it was music. So they're both large musical compositions for orchestra, choir, and soloist. But opera is musical theater with interaction between the characters, with props and sets. I'm reading the slide, I recognize that. And focused on history and mythology, whereas oratorio focused on sacred topics. and was much more a concert piece. And so the first oratorio is generally known to be done by Emilio de Cavalieri. Now, he's from Rome, but he was in Florence much of the time that we're talking about, except he wasn't part of Florentine Camarata. There's a story behind that one in a bit. And he had Representazione di Anima et di Corpo, a work about the soul and the body. So, so you have the orchestra performing, you have the soloists in front. Now here they have people acting in the back. In the church at the time, they would not have that. And then you get the choir coming in to comment on what's going on. So Cavalieri composed this oratorio, although I note Cavalieri was not only a composer, but also a director and a dancer. And the first version of this was actually performed on stage more as an opera than as an oratorio. So the fact that it's called the first oratorio instead of the first opera is a sore spot for Cavalieri. There was a point he was in charge of music for Lorenzo de' Medici, who had come to Florence at the time, a little earlier than 1600. And he helped to compose one of the big pieces of that time, but he was not invited to actually be in charge of the great performances of the wedding of Medici. And so he stormed off in a huff and never came back to Florence again. You'll see in his writings that he keeps talking about how he was the first one to do monody and opera. And he pointed to the publication date in February 1600 as proof that he was the one, not others that were said to be the ones to be the first composers. Oh. So I'm going to pause for a moment here and make sure that people are hearing what I'm saying and that they can hear the music that I'm playing. And if you have any questions so far.
Yeah, we can hear just fine, or at least I can.
Excellent, good, thank you. Any questions so far?
Yeah, I don't really get to talk about it in my class later on, but could you go into the rivalry between Cavalieri and Cassini?
I wish that I had more about it. And I'm noting it for a future version of this. I will get more of that information. Perry and Caccini had composed operas early on. The first one was Daphne, and then they had a version of Euridice, which would have been in 1607, which is the first surviving one. We have very little, if anything, left of Daphne. And that was also considered the first opera. So I don't have an example of that one to listen to. I note, though, that as this Florentine Camarata went on, they focused on these Greek stories. And the Greek story, the best of the lot, was, of course, Orpheus and Eurydice, the Greek story of the best musician in the world whose love was taken to hell, and he had to go down and get her and bring her back out. And as long as he doesn't turn around, she will come out. But he turned around and looked at her, and she was stuck in hell. This is a glorious drama. And in 1480, it was written up as the story there in Florence. And so it was extremely popular. So it's not surprising that Perry and Caccini would write about Eurydice. And then we have the gentleman who I will speak of next, who wrote about from Orfeo's point of view, but that's coming soon. Monteverdi became part of that Florentine Camarata later on, after Bardi had left to go to Rome and others continued the tradition. And if you look at his various books of madrigals, you can watch as changes happen from his early work in 1583, which was reserved but still had chromatic progressions coming into it, to his later works where he kept putting in more dissonance without resolution, getting into the modern language of key and of progressions and of harmonic progressions that were very different from the way they talked about music with the modes of music before him. Now, he also had that idea that the text was more important than the music, that the poet's images were supreme over the music. This got him into a bit of trouble. There was this glorious controversy. Now, both Monteverdi and Artusi studied under Zarlino, the best theorist of the time, supposedly the best theorist all the way from Aristophanes in ancient Greece. You know, Boethius, moron, not worth paying attention to compared to Zarlino. Both of these gentlemen, and many in the Camarata, studied under Zarlino. But Monteverdi decided to go in a different direction. And so when he complained about Zarlino's music as being out of date, as being the old style, Stile Antico, Artusi decided to defend Zarlino and the music of that time, the flowing counterpoint, the properly prepared dissonance that would resolve. If it's a flat, it has to resolve up. If it's a sharp, it has to resolve down. That is the rules of counterpoint and of dissonance. Do not break them. Monteverdi wrote back in his 5th book of Madrigal, saying that the Stile Nuovo, this second practice, with its monody, with its accompanied recitative, and with breaking the rules of counterpoint on purpose in service to the text, he defended and promoted the new ideas for composition. And honestly, Monteverdi is the well-known world-class musician. Artusi is known for his controversy with Monteverdi. So what I want to play here is one of Monteverdi's madrigals, Oi me se tanto amate. Listen to the sighing sound of this. So those of you familiar with madrigals will recognize the text painting where you have the sigh. You will have it sound like it's a sigh that Monteverdi brought in from the madrigals. But this is much more dissonant, much more modern to their ears than most of the madrigals prior to Monteverdi. Monteverdi is considered the first composer of laments. Now, admittedly, there were laments in Greek, there were laments throughout our history, but actually having a solo lament where you were conveying the emotion of the lament is generally attributed to Monteverdi. Was the first one to do this. Now, what I want to play for you is Lasciatemi morire, both the five-voice madrigal composed in 1614 and then the monody from his opera Arianna in 1623. So let's start with our Swanholm singers. I'm going to stop it there. And then I want to go to the solo version of the same. So beautiful. In their viewpoints, especially the viewpoints of the Florentine Camarata, the madrigal, while wonderful, while beautiful, was more in service to the music than to the emotion and the text, whereas that monody was much more in service to the text to convey that emotion more strongly. As Monteverdi was composing, he realized that there was a type of music missing. He could now convey sadness, he could convey joy in music. But what he wanted to convey was anger, was the warlike or angry emotions. And so he created this idea of Stile Concitato, or agitated style. Rapid repeated notes, extended trills. And I will play a version of this for you from his La Pelegrina. I was supposed to have an example of that rapid repeated notes and extended trills, but the saved version of it and the version that I have there are different. So I am going to skip over. Honestly, some of these things were done before. Some of you may recognize La Guerre by Clement Janiquin from 50 years earlier. And let's bring that one up by the King's Singers. Here's a better version of it. There we go. So, a more warlike feeling, often equated to the drums of the battlefield. And Monteverdi would use this to show anger, to show agitation. I have one more example for you. And this is from Monteverdi's most famous opera, his earliest one, and the earliest opera that is regularly performed these days, his L'Orfeo. Oh. And you will see in this performance the solo voice, the emotion conveyed as Orfeo sings about the death of Eurydice. And I'm going to move us along a little bit here. So this musical journey of changing from polyphony to monody, of making the text and the meaning of the text more important, and of adding different styles to be able to convey different emotions, happened within the course of those years from about 1575 to here in 1607. Opera took the musical world by storm, and it expanded to the wonderful operas that we have today, to the oratorios that we have. And I hope that you will take these little glimpses of these different styles and go and search out some of these works and some of these styles to be able to enjoy them even more.